I think they do realize that, and maybe not all of them, but most of them do. They understand we're watching them, we're going to hold them accountable, and it's time to cut the government's credit card. It's time to stop doing this. If I gave a credit card to my kids and they were spending out of control, I'd say cut it. Unfortunately, what's happening in D.C. is the government is using our children's credit card, and it's time to cut it up.
Will the Tea Party-supported Republicans stay true to their principles no matter what kind of a deal the leadership in the House cuts?
If they don't stay true to their principles, we'll be there watching, and if they don't stay true, we're going to primary them. All
right. Meaning you're going to run people against them in their primaries next year.
Regardless of party, we want people to be fiscally responsible, want to stand for constitutionally limited government and free markets.
Got it. Jenny Beth Martin, it's a pleasure. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
The Senate today rejecting two competing spending bills. The government now operating on a short-term plan that expires March 18th. That's the end of next week. So what's next in the fiscal fight? Our panel weighs in next. Both the Republican and Democratic-backed spending cuts failed to pass in the Senate today, with 10 Democrats voting against their own party's proposal. And with the clock ticking toward the threat of a government shutdown on March 18th, that's next Friday, lawmakers scrambled to keep Washington afloat. Meanwhile, the country is still going broke from overspending, entitlements, rising gas and food prices. So how do we stop the bleeding? Steve Moore, senior economic writer for the Wall Street Journal. Yaron Brook, president of the Ayn Rand Center for Individual Rights. And Eric Bolling, host of Follow the Money, and my good buddy and my colleague on the Fox Business Network. Eric, to you first. Do you think the Republicans in the House cave, vote to raise the debt ceiling, vote to let the government borrow more money, give the president some kind of credibility, which he probably doesn't deserve?
Yeah, absolutely. Well put, Judge. He doesn't deserve it. Yeah, I think they're going to do this. I think they're going to, like you pointed out earlier, guess what? They're going to go maybe not 2 years for 2 weeks for a continuing resolution. They may go 4. They may go 6. Big smokescreen, Judge. You know what we're talking about? We're talking about cutting $61 billion or $31 billion. Can I just do this? May I do this quickly, Judge? I know you know they have a lot of time.
Don't tell me I have another gimmick.
Here's a $100 bill, right? Yaron, will you hold that for me?
Absolutely.
Here's 100. But that's the national debt that you just showed earlier in the show. Here's what they want to cut, Judge, right there. That's if the Republicans get their way. 43 cents on a $100 bill.
All right.
It's a joke.
Does anybody in the Republican Party, aside from the real small government folks like Ron Paul, Rand Paul, we just had Alan West and Connie Mack on, take the debt seriously?
I don't think so. I mean, I'm disappointed even in Paul Ryan, who I thought was much more radical than he turned out to be.
You're talking about the chair of the House Budget Committee and a member of the Republican leadership and a so-called fiscal hawk.
That's what they said. And then his initial proposal was $30 billion. It wasn't even the nickel here. It was half a nickel. And then he comes back with $60 billion on a $1.7 trillion deficit, $3.7 trillion budget.
Steve Moore, how close are we to serious inflation? Are things like food, gasoline, and beer, of all things, starting to go up? And if so, why?
Yeah, well, look, with reference to this budget crisis, because I think it all ties in, Judge, I think what you've got going on is people have to realize this is not a fire alarm we're talking about. This is a real financial crisis as a result of this enormous debt. And this idea that we can't cut $50 or $60 billion out of this debt, that's 2 days of federal government spending. So it's trivial. Now, here's the point. When you talk about these price increases, we are starting to see the specter of rising prices. We see it in airline prices. We see it obviously at the gas pump with 30-cent increases just in the last 2 weeks.
Right.
My goodness, Judge, a box of Cheerios now costs $3.50.
Right.
And this is putting a squeeze on middle-class families because, you know what? Wages aren't rising, so it means that every time prices go up, it's like a hidden tax increase on the American family.
Eric, I want to go to your expertise, which is not beer. It's oil.
Well, it may be
it's oil. Did oil flatten out a little bit today? Because it looks like Gaddafi's winning. Give me a little background.
Judge, here's what's going on. When this whole Middle Eastern turmoil started, oil was around $86 a barrel. At 104 today, down from 105, it's skyrocketing. Also, what we don't see on the gas pump, you see the national average, that AAA number, 352, 353. Throw that out. oil prices, gasoline prices on the world oil markets have skyrocketed. There's another 30 or 40 cents per gallon baked in
how
already.
responsible is the Federal Reserve for all this?
Oh, hugely responsible. That was the point I was going to make. It's not just Libya. We are printing money like there's no tomorrow.
Right.
Have been for 2 or 3 years now. This is a monetary inflation. When you flood the markets with the amount of money that we're flooding the markets with, and if banks start lending money, as everybody's urging them to do, lend money, inflation could spiral out of control here.
Why doesn't Ben Bernanke and why don't the big government people in both parties understand this, Steve Moore? I mean, this is really basically economics 101. There's no, as Ronald Reagan would say, there's no rocket science to this.
This ain't rocket science. And by the way, I wish I were as rich as Eric, carrying around those $100 bills with him. But
that $100 bill is the tip of the iceberg.
If we have continued inflation, you're going to need $100 bills to pay your bills. Look, I don't understand why people don't get what Milton Friedman taught all of us 50 years ago, which that inflation is just too many dollars chasing too few goods. And Eric, correct me, you're the economist here, but if you've got the Fed putting out $600 billion, you know what? That causes higher prices.
Eric,
it's a squeeze on the middle class. Big problem.
I'm sorry to cut you off, but we heard today, Dennis Lockhart, the chairman of the Atlanta Fed, saying, you know what? If oil prices go to $150 a barrel, his solution, print more money, accommodate, ease more. These guys just don't get it. They need to stop.
That sounds like the 1970s, right?
Bernanke was going to hold back. No?
No, Bernanke's not going to hold back. He doesn't know how to hold back. Holding back now would mean raising interest rates and, from their perspective, crushing the U.S. economy. And they're terrified of the so-called Great Depression that could be caused. Look, these people are completely ignorant of what happens when you print money. And it doesn't always go into CPI, as Friedman taught us. Sometimes it goes into housing prices or into oil. It doesn't go equally, and therefore it's sometimes hidden, but there's massive inflation out there.
Got it. Steve Moore, Eric Bolling, you're on Brooke. It's a pleasure. Thank you for joining us. President Obama's health care law hitting another roadblock today. Details from Congresswoman Michelle Bachmann. Next. The Obama administration's health care law is one step closer to ending up in the Supreme Court. The White House has appealed a judge's landmark ruling that the law is unconstitutional because it forces Americans to buy health insurance or be fined by the federal government. But if you live in Maine, listen to this. The entire state has been granted an exemption for a key provision. Who better to talk about this than Congresswoman Michelle Bachmann? She's here. She opposes Obamacare. She wants Congress to get back the $105 billion already approved for spending, which she says is buried in the health care law. Congresswoman Bachmann, it's a pleasure. Welcome to the Glenn Beck program. How did this $105 billion thing get in there so that the money will automatically be spent unless Congress rescinds all of Obamacare? How did that happen?
Well, it was put in such a way, and let me show you. This is the health care bill, Judge. It's so big we have to put it in 2 books, and I've marked all the places where Speaker Pelosi and Harry Reid buried the spending, and it adds up, like you said, to $105 billion, $464 million. How did they get it in there? This is highly unusual to put spending in an authorization bill. And the best way to describe it is to say, we in the federal government could give a free ticket to Disney World for every American. We could authorize that. But until we allocate the money, appropriate it, nobody's going to go there.
All right, why?
And what Speaker Pelosi did is she combined both the authorizing and the appropriating. Nobody expected it, including the Congressional Budget Office.
All right, why is it that certain states have been granted exemptions from it? Today we learned that Maine, the state of Maine, has been granted an exemption from virtually all aspects of this bill. So if you live in Maine, you don't have to comply with health care. If you're running the government of Maine, if you're the governor of Maine, the legislature in Maine, you don't have to raise taxes and spend money as the feds tried to tell you to do in that bill. So question, how does Maine get off the hook and the other 49 states don't?
I want a waiver for myself.
Right.
I bet you do. I bet the people in the state of Minnesota want a waiver from Obamacare. This is an admission of failure. And, Judge, worse than that, it's a denial of equal protection under the law per our Constitution.
Yes.
One more constitutional challenge, one more reason we have to defeat this bill. And the good news is we have a remedy. We're going to run out of money to fund the government on March 18th. We have an opportunity to have Republicans come together, put language in that would tell President Obama, you're going to give the money back to implement Obamacare in this clearly unconstitutional bill. And so it's important that your listeners let their member of Congress know and demand that we put this language in the next funding of our government.
All right, if you put it in and it passes the House and somehow it passes the Senate, it would require his signature or an override of a veto for that $105 billion to stop. Otherwise, as I understand it, you and I have discussed this elsewhere, the $105 gets spent and there's nothing the Congress can do about it. Those checks are just going to start to roll, whether the cash is in the bank or not.
It's already rolling, Judge. People need to know that President Obama is putting Obamacare in at lightning speed. He's already written over 6,000 pages of rules and regulations. Today, as you and I are talking, they are spending $5 billion right now this year to implement Obamacare. So we have to get this money pulled back, or what we realize, the president's been given post-dated checks for the next 8 years of over $105 billion to implement this bill. We've got a chance to pull it back. People can get more information on my Facebook site, but what we really need is to have them call their member of Congress and demand, don't spend one more red cent on government unless Obama gives it back. And what that could mean then is the continuing resolution may not be able to get through.
Well, if the continuing resolution doesn't get through, that is, if the government's authority to spend money stops on March 18th and the government closes down, except for the essential parts of it, who will get blamed? Will it be the Republicans in Congress like in '95, or will it be the Democrat in the White House who's out of touch with the times?
I think it will be the Democrat in the White House who's out of touch with the times. He needs to explain to the American people, Judge, why he didn't bother to tell them that he was spending $105 billion of their money. I think that's a big issue. He's got to explain why nobody knew about this expenditure.
All right, Congresswoman Michelle Bachmann, like your fellow Tea Party Republicans, you have a lot of work cut out for you. Keep up the fight, and thank you for joining us here.
Thank you, Judge.
They fled their state 3 weeks ago to avoid a vote. Now the 14 Democratic senators missing in action from Wisconsin are going to have to pay a price. Find out what it is next.